We will be starting here in just about 60 seconds. We'll give people time to log in, get things set up, and then we will get going here shortly. Thank you everyone for being here. I see lots of people signing in. We had wonderful registration for this event and already over 100 attendees here today. So that is really fantastic. We'll just buy a little bit more time here to let people log in, and then we will get going. Again, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Okay, we're going to get going. So my name is Larkin McGowan. I am here in the corporate strategic marketing group for Armanino, and I am managing the logistics here today, and we'll be handing everything off to our wonderful moderator and panel here in just a moment. What we need to do first off the bat, though, is handle a couple of logistics. So make sure, just housekeeping wise, right? There's a little panel that's available to you. Make sure your settings are correct. If you're calling through a cell phone, you need to make sure you're in the cell phone mode, computer mode, all of that good stuff. So make sure you familiarize yourself with that panel. Maximizing and minimizing the screens are all available to you through that. Here we go. This is kind of what it looks like when you make sure you're calling in through the correct audio. One of the things you do need to know is if you are wanting CPE today, you do need to be calling through your personal computer, and I'll cover that here in just a moment. So to qualify for CPE today, you must be using your personal computer. So make sure you're logged in through there, your unique URL. Make sure you are logged into the software for at least 50 of the minutes of this event. So stay to the end. It's going to be so good, you're going to want to stay to the end. So that's just going to be true. Make sure that you respond to 75% of the polling questions. So what that means is 3 of the 4 polling questions. Okay, so there'll be 4 polling questions. Make sure you are present and with us in answering at least 3 of those questions. And finally, you will have a survey that you do need to complete in order to qualify for CPE. So at the end of the webinar, when it closes, it will either pop up automatically for you or be immediately emailed to you. Make sure you complete that survey. All right, so what you're going to learn today, understanding the key challenges and goals of your counterparts. So we're talking about SOX programming here, right? You're identifying opportunities to streamline your SOX program, leveraging best practices, and gaining insights into innovation and automation strategies that drive efficiency for your program. And so with that said, we've done the logistics. It's time to get to the fun. And I'm going to kick this over for introductions. We have both Armanino representatives and Workiva representatives, and we are going to start with Cristiano Brandalise to introduce himself, and off we go. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Larkin. Hello, everybody. My name is Cristiano. I'm a managing director with Armanino. Been doing SOX for 15 years. I still believe that SOX is sexy. I also married a consultant to that SOX. So while you guys are talking about holiday decorations at night at dinner, I usually talk about RCM and ERCs. So I'm also leading the innovation initiative at Armanino. My dream is one day just to wake up and ask Alexa how many controls we have to test, how many they passed, how many they failed. We are not there yet, but we are going there, and I will be glad to share some good things that we are doing with automation in order for you to be more efficient with your program. And then I am giving the mic to Todd from his beautiful, decorated already with Christmas lights room.
Thank you, Cristiano. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Todd Bishop, I'm a partner in Armanino's risk assurance and advisory practice. I've been working in risk and controls for over 20 years. I started my career with PwC, where I spent 12 years in the risk assurance practice there, working with both public and private companies on the external audit and consulting side. From there, I left risk assurance and went to industry, and I led global internal audit and SOX for 7 years at 2 public companies in the Bay Area before returning to professional services. Joined Armanino 2.5 years ago, and I helped lead our SOX internal audit and our SOC audit practice at risk assurance.
Perfect.
Ashley.
So I'm Ashley. I am a regional sales director at Workiva, specializing in the integrated risk solution set. Prior to joining Workiva in May, I actually spent the first 10 years of my career in public accounting, both as an external auditor and the last 7 years at Armanino in the risk advisory practice, managing our outsourced SOX and internal audit clients. I was actually a big part of the initiative to spin up a partnership between Armanino and Workiva. So I have an interesting skill set sitting on both sides of the fence. So excited to kind of share the results of our benchmarking survey with you today.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Thande. I am a director in our product marketing team at Workiva. Prior to coming to Workiva, I spent 16 years of my professional career in both internal audit as well as SOX compliance roles. Like Todd, I started at PwC in the risk and assurance practice, so we have a similar background there. I also have the honor and privilege of serving as an executive advisor to the SOX and Internal Controls Professionals Group, also known as SOX Pro. This is an online-only group. We provide a platform for internal controls, compliance professionals, as well as internal audit professionals to come together, share best practice, specifically around SOX compliance, but other sort of compliance management programs. We are open to membership, so if you're interested in joining us, please do look us up. soxprofessionals.org is our website, and I'll be happy to share that on the chat. But I'm looking forward to engaging in a good and lively discussion.
Thank you, David. I'm Liam Collins. Thank you all for attending this morning. I'm a partner with Armanino. I run our risk assurance and advisory practice. I've been doing this for about 20 years, including over 10 years with Big Four firms. Armanino, for anyone that doesn't know, we're a firm of about 1,500 people, about 15 offices across the country, full service audit, tax, consulting firm. And the folks from Armanino with you today are all from our risk assurance and advisory practice, where we do lots of SOX 404 work, cyber, data privacy, SOC work, and a host of other IT attestation work. So very excited. I'm going to be your moderator today, asking some questions of my colleagues here, and going through some of the key results and takeaways we have from the benchmark report. You want to move on, Laura? But what we did think, as we started this, we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the unique situation we're all in right now. The benchmark study was kicked off quite a few months ago, so some of the results, while very impactful and very timely, don't fully capture, the situation from a COVID-19 perspective. It's been a very interesting few months. And so some of the things we're seeing from an Armanino perspective, our clients, it has had an impact, but maybe not the impact we initially thought. Very much so at the very beginning of this, we were concerned that we're going to see a significant increase in the number of deficiencies of our clients because of people working remotely, that not having the focus on performing controls that maybe we would have hoped for. But that hasn't actually come to fruition to the level that we were concerned about. What we are seeing, I believe, is companies being very innovative and really going after, building a SOX program that is truly being adapted to the future. We're working remotely, the fact that we're working remotely has been factored into cybersecurity risk assessments for SOX. IT folks are very, very busy setting people up, but that's already been factored into the risk assessments we're seeing. We're seeing people, I'm sure you're going to see this. The biggest impact really is you're being asked to do more with less. You have less people, you've got less financial resources. The pressure out there to accomplish the same level of compliance or even better, with less resources is really being put in front of you guys this year. But we're seeing most of our clients really stepping up to that challenge, being innovative, including leveraging the 302 certification program to monitor for changes because of COVID, the changes to frequency of the control, the owners of the control, how the control is being performed. So really our clients stepping up and trying to see how can we adapt, knowing that this is not going to end anytime soon. I know we're thinking it's the middle of next year, but then again, people are working remotely could go on for a significant period of time. So we really are seeing our clients stepping up, doing things differently and adapting. That's certainly from an Armanino perspective. Ashley?
Yeah, so we've seen a big uptick in people reaching out looking for a tool specifically to help them manage their SOX program remotely. Like you mentioned, I think in the beginning of all this, people kind of just put a pause on everything and panicked and not realizing this was going to go on until next year. And a lot of the, especially companies here in the Bay Area, are talking about not having people come on site until next summer. So the reality of you're going to have to go through probably at least a half of a year managing your SOX program remotely with either an internal team or consultants, managing that expectation with your external auditors. So we've had quite a few people reach out to see how our tool can help bring the virtual environment together and bring that whole collaborative remote work environment inside the tool. So that's definitely seen an uptick for us in that sector.
Laura can move on. So David, we're going to get some background on the approach, the participation that we got for the benchmark report. Maybe you can give us some background on that.
Yes, thank you, Liam. So just by way of background, the SOX Professionals Group has been performing this survey since 2016. So 2020 marked our 5th year of performing this particular survey. And what this survey tries to do or attempts to do is get a pulse of the profession from the practitioner's point of view. What is that life cycle of SOX compliance looking like on the ground? So we asked various questions that span from the complexity of your controls program, looking at the number of controls in your environment, the type of controls, be those entity level, business controls, IT controls, the locations where these teams are actually executing compliance. Is it one location? Is it multi-location? We also looked at the dynamics in terms of who is involved in SOX compliance. Is it internal audit? Is it different teams? Or is it also a co-source, outsource dynamic? And ultimately, we also looked at elements of the role of technology, which for us at Workiva is very critical. How deep or how embedded is technology in SOX compliance? Is it underpinning or is it still something a little nascent? We also explore issues around the controls, what the issues around the failures or challenges that organizations are having in terms of optimizing and getting to the classic utopian view of SOX compliance. So looking at challenges, opportunities, and future state. So in 2020, we got responses from close to 420 individuals. That was a good uptick. We typically range between the 400 and 450. So that was a good representation of the entire industry. We got a good representation from different folks in different organizational stratas. So this year we were really targeting the population of the C-suite, and we're happy to say that we got 7% response from that C-suite. So that's your CFO and the CEO, as well as your CIO respondents. We also got a fair chunk of response from the folks on the ground who are actually doing the work. So about 60% from managers and staff, individuals who can really provide that particular perspective on what it is and how they're running their SOX programs, as well as all the individuals who are actually managing SOX programs. So at your director and vice president level. In terms of the results, and I know we'll deep dive into this as we go through our panel, but just a quick inkling of what we saw. Efficiency on SOX programs still keeps coming up as an area that SOX teams are struggling with. The cost of compliance is something that we were surprised to see is still upticking, given that we've been in a SOX compliance regime, at least here in the US, for the last 17 years. We also saw impact of cybersecurity, which, Liam, is more of an early indicator because we put this survey out into the market in late Q1. So the ramifications of COVID-19 had not really been felt yet, but the fact that we did see a lot of response coming back from concerns around cybersecurity and information technology in general was a good leading indicator. As well as maybe a third point I would harness here was the fact that internal audit as a function is still taking on quite a bit of that responsibility of SOX compliance, which we were not expecting. If anything, we had a point of view, we'd see that kind of becoming more second line, but happily to discuss that as we delve into the panel. But that is the background on our SOX survey. We will be sharing this out. If anyone hasn't seen this, we will provide a link as some takeaway materials. You can read that. We did also provide a 5-year recap, and I'll be happy to share that. But that was our survey in a nutshell.
That's great. Thank you, David. In addition to the benchmark survey, and we certainly will be digging into a lot of the results from that survey here over the next few minutes, Armanino has also put out a summary. So the report is very good. It's very detailed. There's a summary available to each of you as well that we can send across that will give you some of the high points from what we discussed both today and what we saw as a result as we went through this. So, all right. So let's move into some of the results. All right, organization's top priorities. I think it's very interesting. The biggest priority that we're seeing, and quite a significant jump from last year, just how do you improve the efficiency of the SOX function? I think very interesting fact, right? We're 17 years into doing SOX, and efficiency is still the biggest challenge for folks. So just for the panel, maybe starting with you, Todd, what do you think companies are still struggling after all this time to build a sustainable and efficient program?
I don't think it's for a lack of trying, Liam. Companies have been doing this for so long, but they're really managing through a constant state of change, right? When you think about whether it's in the business, dealing with mergers and acquisitions, dealing with system implementation, right? Anything related to changes in people, process, and technology, that has an impact on the work you do. You need to update your understanding and evaluate those changes, how it impacts the scope of your SOX work. You need to constantly stay abreast of those changes to make sure there aren't any last-minute surprises that require significant changes to the test strategy. I think also another factor related to change is the external auditor's perspective, right? As the external auditor receives their latest review reports from the PCAOB, their national offices are telling them where they really need to apply additional pressure in their external audit, right? And a lot of times those changes come late in the year after planning is far from, has been completed for a long time, and they're trying to get through year end. So understanding where the auditor's areas of scrutiny will be is really something that's challenging to be proactive about, right? It's often a reactive position to be in. Related to that point, not so much from a change perspective, but from an external auditor perspective, is when the financial statement audit finds an accounting error, right? That you have a lot of churn related to surprises in the audit that were not necessarily detected through the evaluation of controls. And SOX teams and internal audit teams are spending a lot of time with management trying to assess the potential impact of these issues. They're trying to spend a lot of time updating the board on understanding what's relevant for the audit committee, right? And that all adds hours to the project plan every year. Finally, I think really just a practical necessity is budget constraints, right? There's really this notion of diminishing marginal return. And after the 17 years of executing SOX going way back to 2004, right, there's only so much you can do in your process from a manual perspective. And a lot of the changes that would be needed to drive efficiencies, whether it's technologies or people, those require investments, right? And oftentimes there's pressure on the budget, and internal audit teams and SOX teams can't make the investment that they want to make to improve their process.
Absolutely. I know we're seeing lots of budgetary pressure this year. Again, it's do more with less in a very challenging year. David, Cristiano, Ashley, anything you want to add to that?
Just one thing that I still notice is that SOX sometimes is just like, it's not embedded in the day-to-day activities of a company. It's like the auditors ask me. So, and then the company is struggling in order to find the documentation in order to make us happy. We had this concept of continuous monitoring, continuous audit, continuous monitoring that was introduced like years and years ago. We're still like struggling with that. One of the things that we are trying to tell our clients is that it's not the training that we do once or twice a year that is going to solve the problems. It's not us asking the PBC list twice a year that is going to solve the problem. It's just like, it's this continuous reiteration that SOX should be embedded in your activities. Otherwise, everything that is created ad hoc for the auditors is inefficient.
Absolutely. I know we've been big advocates with our clients around just how do you take a holistic approach to risk management, right? Not just for SOX, but for all your other compliance requirements. And how do you take a step back? How do you leverage technology? How do you hopefully move away from that point in time audit? And we're seeing more and more clients thinking that way, to say the world of auditing is changing. And can you move away from the risk and struggle you have each and every year in being compliant to really knowing your compliance posture at any point in time? And how do you leverage technology to do that? David, Ashley, anything like that?
I was just going to actually mention the same thing Cristiano mentioned. So when we talk about why we are not where we need to be, given the 17 or so years we've been doing SOX compliance, to me, there's an element of, the reactive nature of SOX programs. We're ticking a box. It's more compliance as opposed to partnering with the business. So to Cristiano's point, so we've got to take it out of the, every 1 or 2 times a year we're doing this, but more lockstep with the business. So again, once we evolve, and I think some good indicators from our 2020 survey, the fact that the C-suite is taking more onus or more attraction to that particular space, definitely going to be some sort of fuel to that fire to move that beyond compliance, but more towards the operational efficiencies and just making the business better off eventually.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think to add on to that point, right, you can draw a corollary for those that are in the internal audit space joining us today, right? If you think about the difference between an annual enterprise risk assessment or implementing a full enterprise risk management program, right, you can see those stark differences between companies that have actually embedded risk-based decision-making into their operational and strategic processes versus companies that only touch it once a year as a check-the-box exercise.
Absolutely. So these are the results we got from the benchmark study, but now we've got a polling question to see what the audience think. We'll give you guys a few minutes to respond to this, or at least a good 2 seconds. So the top priority of respondents was to improve the SOX program efficiency. What's driving your team to be more efficient? Is it to free up capacity to reallocate resources to other priorities, respond to budget pressures and constraints? Is to add value to stakeholders and decrease overall risk? Is a combination of all? Or lastly, maybe efficiency is not your top priority this year. So we'll give a few more seconds here for people to answer, just remembering that please answer 3 of the 4 questions so that you do get your CPA credits today. All right. I think we got a clear, basically a response to the thing we talked about: free up capacity, responding to budget pressures, and adding value. I think fairly even across the board in combination of all. So it does seem like the audience here are very much in lockstep with the results we got from the benchmark study. So
yeah, and what I think is interesting, Liam, is that as auditors, all of us probably would like to focus on efficiency, to free up capacity and be more productive, right? To add value in areas that are both strategic and operationally critical to the business, so that we're not just focused on compliance. But some of the reality embedded in those statistics may be that they've been asked to cut budgets, right? And the budget pressures to be efficient isn't necessarily about increasing capacity. It may be about reducing headcount or using consultants on a scalable model, right, where you don't have as many dollars to deploy them throughout the year.
Absolutely. And I guess given those challenges, back to the panel, what are some innovative approaches you've seen from your clients? Some best practices in actually driving efficiencies in our SOX program this year. David, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. And it's very akin to what you mentioned earlier. It's trying to do more with less, right? So one of the things we're seeing a lot of our customers come up to us is, how do we give this SOX teams autonomy to execute and minimize the bottlenecks that keep coming up and draw in inefficiencies, right? So we do have in the Workiva solution something that's a great value add to organizations, is the ability to tap into underlying source systems, so via APIs or connectors. And what that gives teams is the ability to tap into populations, to pull those samples independently and autonomously without having to create, as I said, that handover to either via PBC list or the time that it takes for that information to come back. So you minimize that turnaround, you give those SOX teams more autonomy. And again, you give them more execution to go out and do what they need to do. And then secondly, there's the element of digitalization. When we talk about SOX compliance or even risk management, writ large, it's not a question of eliminating all risk, but it's mitigating risk to an acceptable level. So when we think about that, it's why do we not focus on where the risk exists as opposed to just being very blanket? So if you can come up with digitalization strategies, and that could be any sort of visualization tools, be it Tableau, BI, whatever you might have, that can give you a lens into where that risk sits, where it might be concentrated, That's another way of being innovative to drive greater efficiencies, to harness better and use the little time you have to get better turnaround. So those are two areas we're seeing with our clients, and I trust it's also happening writ large, as I said, given what we're seeing and hearing from our wider membership.
Excellent point. Actually, a really good point that came through the chat, which really is, until we really do push ownership over to the control owners and out of the core SOX team, how do you really be successful? Right? Very often it's easy to look at the SOX program, look at internal audit and put all the responsibility on them, but can you really drive efficiencies until you get buy-in from the control owners? Anyone else from a perspective or what we're seeing at our clients?
Well, Liam, that's an interesting point you brought up about buy-off from the control owners. The last couple customers that I've spoken to, that's been one of their key drivers in getting a tool in place, is to drive control and process owners into the system, regardless of if it's managing PBCs, maybe control execution, or even just the certifying, but driving them to a tool, and it gives them more of a buy-off of getting some pesky email from, okay, twice a year I get this, they have their tasks that they have to do, and they've seen that that's been driving the process to get a tool, as they see the value in having the buy-off from the process owners, and again, kind of ingraining those SOX, the rote SOX tasks in your business, as a, it's less pulling teeth than from them.
Anything we can do to make it easier for them, right? Todd, Christiana, anything you wanted to add on this topic? But I know that we do have some ideas and some of the feedback we got from the benchmark study here around governance and automation. Maybe Christiana, you want to cover some of this?
Sure. Let me just start from the third point, enable proactive versus reactive. How many times you, like in this call, we learn that something has changed, to Todd's point, in the process, like too late. We just, we get there, we start the audit, and then after the facts, we know that the control owner changed, the process changed, and that is, now we have to put something together, together with the company in order to react to this change. I'm big in innovation, and one of the things that we are talking right now is like, the cars are driving by themselves. Why we still have to wait someone to tell us that something happened in order to react to that? So we do have the possibility to use the systems and some, as David says, API. If there are changes in your structure, it's going to be through a system, either ADP or another system, in order to make sure that the person who was the control owner assigned to that control either left the firm or changed in terms of title and position. There will be a trigger event to that. There is going to be an automated communication to the audit team by saying, do I need to take into consideration if I have to change my control approach, control testing approach? So all of these things, and we do have some of these examples, is instead of reacting to something, it's just like proactively knowing and anticipating those changes. Another thing is replacing manual work with automatic workflows. How many times we send out a PBC? I'm just giving you like real examples. We send out a PBC, and then we wait a couple of days and we send out an email to escalate, and then we send out another email to escalate, and then the client asks, did you escalate to the right person? And we have to spend a lot of time talking to the business owners, what happened, why they didn't reply to our request. We are talking with Workiva right now in order to implement an automated workflow that is going to automatically take into consideration and managing the PBC process by itself. Why we need to like take something that is already in the system and managing it outside the system. Another thing is like, the first is like a winning team also wins in like a game with good rules and good playbook. So one of the things that we usually do is like, it's an evolving situation with the client. My suggestion is let's make sure that we sit down and we get some clear and agreed upon rules from everybody at the beginning of the SOX engagement. Too many times we just learn things and we change things on the go after a few months that we started an engagement. It's good to spend some time in order to set up these rules and regulations, and then think about, just try to think outside the box. Are these rules and regulations, rules that we put together through a playbook, can they be automated? We have some, like still an enormous amount, and you see in some of the answers that in one of the questions after, we still manage a lot of things via Excel and emails. And again, we can do better with that. There are a lot of tedious administrative activities that will take your team away from the main focus of like covering, mitigating, and significant risks. So these are the three main areas that we saw, and that's like, to me, still like there's a lot to do, a lot that needs to be done, but we're moving towards the right direction, I guess.
I think if we just automate away the pain of document request management, we'd all be doing very well, right? That just takes so much time as we're going through these projects. Todd, David, Ashley, anything you'd like to add here?
I think, we see a wide spectrum of where companies are on the automation curve, right? And from an audit and SOX perspective, I think you're less likely to be leveraging those technologies if you're not already seeing those technologies embraced in your finance and accounting group. In accounting groups who have implemented RPA, robotic process automation, for their routine, high volume transactions like document data capture, right, things like that. They're more likely to embrace that sort of thing from an audit perspective. And while it may take time to get to the continuous auditing model that Cristiano has alluded to, I think that there are certainly at least low-hanging fruit in process workflows, right? Whether it's PBC requests, whether it's the financial statement risk assessment that we do every year for our clients, and that internal audit and SOX groups too, right? That there's a way to automate that process so that you're getting a refresh on a quarterly basis and making sure that both your materiality determination as well as your assessment of risk across the various line items and accounts doesn't fluctuate or isn't volatile throughout the year. Business performance in the time of COVID certainly has an impact for a lot of companies on their materiality, right? As you look at guidance, and most companies right now aren't guiding out for the full year, right? They might be doing a quarter or 2 quarters ahead, but internally you still have a perspective on where the business thinks it's going to be, and you have to stay on top of assessing or stress testing your materiality assumptions so that your auditors aren't saying, wait a minute, you should have been looking at this entity or this process or this regional office, right, as part of your SOX program, because it's now triggered a materiality threshold because your materiality has declined. So automating that process is really a combination of creating efficiency, but it also speaks, I think, to being proactive versus reactive.
It's also a repetition of, we've seen a lot of clients doing the same thing for years and years. These delays also because why changing? Why going towards a direction that is unknown when in reality I've been doing these things for years. The auditors have been relying on the same type of controls for years. So if you come back, sometimes it's a rubber stamp. Sometimes it's just like, let's do the same thing we did last year. And it's a repetition of things. I'm trying to ask the client to think outside the box. Sometimes the cost of a control is more than the risk that the control is trying to mitigate itself. So why you stopping there? Why you don't ask your auditors, can you do it independently? I'm having my team stress out in order to prepare something that is too much for what's on their plate. We having this type of discussions, like optimization of controls. It's another thing, it's another item. It's like optimizing controls and making sure that the strategy of the company goes along with this optimization. Every time, when we say before, embedding SOX in all the strategy, the company strategy, when you implement a system, it's another system in your big chart of systems that you have. And when the auditors, they take a look at this big map, it's more controls that they have to test. Why not integrating? Why not centralizing? And it's something else that we sometimes, also as auditors, we don't do, because we don't stop altogether and think about, can we do something better, instead of repeating what we did last year.
Well, and I think to that point, Cristiano, I think over the past years, we've had this compliance checkbox look at SOX, or every, we have to test every control that moves, every part that can break down. Let's look at it until we're blue in the face, as opposed to looking at it from a risk base. Like, what happens if this breaks down right here? What really happens? Because what's the effect of that? If it's not that big and we're willing to take the risk of that breaking down, then maybe we don't need to spend, like you said, 20 consulting hours testing that control. And I think that that's the biggest thing, is treating SOX as your overall risk, as a part of your overall risk environment, and what is your company's risk appetite versus let's test everything that moves.
Okay. Perfect. Larkin, moving on. So back to the top priorities, one of the things we thought was interesting, given some of the other information we got around the importance of C-suite involvement, et cetera, was a significant drop off in people who thought that strengthening organizational relationships was very important. I know people are very busy, but maybe over to you, Todd. Any perspective on that? Any ideas around what folks can do given the challenges this year, just to make sure that they're keeping organizational relationships where they need to, just to keep the program to be successful?
Yeah, I know one of the major losses of sort of the practical day-to-day interaction for an audit team, right, is the ability to just walk by the control owners and the stakeholders' offices or cubes, right, and say hi and just check in, right? It's that interpersonal development that builds the trust and credibility that allows for more frequent communication and keeps your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the business. So I think it's important to make sure that you proactively schedule those touch points, even though it might feel a little formal, making sure that you're connecting with the control owners periodically, not just quarterly through the 302 certification process, but regularly, just to check in and see how things are going, see where there can be help. I think that there's no doubt that strengthening relationships among the business and stakeholders is always a key priority, right? But it's sort of to use an old cliche, right, that the squeakiest wheel gets the most oil, right? And that's what we're seeing this year. I think that budget pressure and the realities of what businesses are dealing with on a daily basis are pointing you to what your North Star is on priorities. And so while that's an essential to being successful from a SOX perspective, it might not be the most critical thing that you're going to focus your time on during the year, because you're still trying to figure out your plan for the next 12 months.
David, Cristiano, Ashley, any other thoughts on that one?
I would definitely just echo that, Todd, because one of the discussions we've been having on the SOX Pro Group, especially with some membership, is in this environment where basically we've been forced to work, in a disparate situation away from our offices, that reaching out to those control owners has really helped our practitioners develop more agile ways of thinking, right? So when we talk about really addressing the true risk as opposed to everything under the sun, as Ashley mentioned, that's a definite abyss of failure for most SOX teams when they're trying to control everything or test for everything. That's when the burnout happens. That's when we never meet our goals. But this interaction now with control owners more frequently via the Zoom or whatever you may be using in your organization is helping our organization or even our professionals start becoming more attuned with the business, start realizing this is where we're going, this is the direction we're heading in, this is the risk that we need to start thinking about. So I definitely endorse that, getting more connected with the organization. It was something that came out of our SOX survey. As I said, at the time, people didn't realize that they were going to be in a disparate environment, but let distance not be the issue that stops us. So there's so many forums we can do that by. And the fact that it's giving us more agility, I think it's definitely a win-win and definitely a move in the right direction of really traversing that space between just a check the box, but more of a business partner in how we execute as SOX compliance teams.
I think the world we're living in right now, working remotely, is not going to end anytime soon, right? It's, we're seeing companies and our clients talking about reducing their real estate footprint, changing the way they work fundamentally, allowing people to travel and work all over the country. This remote work, it could be entirely, the way we do business going forward. So, factoring that in, making the effort to reach out, have the touch points. It is hard, you can't just drop into somebody's office, but, taking the time to really build those relationships, still being very, very key. Cristiano, did you want to add something?
Just one thing that it helped with some of my clients, clarity of expectations with the control owners. So if you think about sometimes your SOX program, you prepare a Gantt chart that you share with the SOX director, but you don't share with the control owner. So they don't know what to expect for the rest of the SOX program during the year. What helps us a lot is like, okay, for the next few months, you're going to see my face like a few times. And this is where you're going to see my face. Setting up some expectations as well, because otherwise what happens is that sometimes they receive a PBC in the midst of a closing, and they weren't expecting that. So, and we had a discussion in order to plan ahead. There are some controls that we can move, the calendar of testing can be moved, can be switched. It's just an interaction in between ourselves, the business partners, and the auditors. But we found some efficiencies by making sure that the control owners, they know what's coming next, not just like a couple of weeks from now, but also in 6 months, so they get prepared. And at the beginning, one of the things that I had one control owner coming to me and say, what do you want from me? Because every single time you change your mind, okay? So sitting down and setting up clear expectations of what the controls should be. And as Ashley said, there are things that probably we can pass, we can just leave aside, but there are things that are important attributes of the testing of the control that must be there. So we got some good notes from clients saying like, I really appreciate the fact that you give some clarity of the entire program. And one of the things that we try to do, and we are collaborating with Workiva, is like the control owner having like a dashboard with some activities in terms of like a timeline of activities throughout the year for all the compliance activities that they have to perform.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, Cristiano, that I think on top of transparency around the timeline and setting expectations, I think also having a mindset where you welcome input from the control owner on how the program can be more effective from an execution perspective, right? I think, we're not spending a lot of time talking about controls optimization today or a risk-based approach, because those have been foundational principles, right, since really AS2 came out, or AS5, right? And it's a given that needs to be considered every year, right? Are our controls optimized? Are we taking a risk-based approach? But nonetheless, teams tend to fall into that mindset of, we did this last year, let's do it again this year, without thinking about, are there better ways to vary the nature, timing, and extent of our testing, right, that would allow us to be more efficient? So I think that getting input from the control owners on the timing of testing is really important. Why test a control multiple times a year if it has no history of failure, right? If it's not likely to lead to a significant deficiency or material weakness in and of itself. Test it late in the year, you get your coverage throughout the year and you move on. If for some reason there was an exception in the year and you can't remediate that at year end, well, you're not really on the hook for a large risk, right? It's not likely to cause a material weakness.
Absolutely, great point. And I know, just moving on to some of the other key findings, so we get through them from the benchmark report. One of the interesting things we saw, we're still looking at about 1/3 of the respondents using desktop tools. So maybe today we can talk a little bit about, what does it take to actually switch to a dedicated GRC or SOX tool? And what are some of the benefits of doing that? Maybe starting with you, Ashley.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of see the switch to a tool is a little bit daunting for a lot of people that have never used one before. We kind of have it twofold, where we see like really mature SOX programs that have always managed it in desktop tools, and they are nervous about kind of what the implementation would take. That's kind of more of like the lift and shift. Or we also, on the other end of the spectrum, see a lot of people building out their SOX program and just starting their 404B compliance journey, and in that kind of hellscape of documentation wrangling and seeing the need for a tool. So both of those, from what it actually takes from your team is just a documentation turnover to kind of go into a tool. But I think one of the things that you can see from using a dedicated SOX tool like Workiva, for example, is that gained efficiency. Obviously, that's been the running theme of the webinar, that's what everyone is really striving for. And I think the way that we kind of get there, and our big key points and how we give time back to your team, is an increase in your data consistency. We have everything linked out. Everything's linked to your RCM. So changes, you're not saying, oh, this change in the RCM, I need to change it in the narrative and the flow chart. That's all kind of an automatic push. We see an increase in overall visibility to your SOX program. You can see where your testing status is, where your PBCs are at the click of a button. You just open up the tool and you see it, instead of having to kind of, I remember not very fondly my days in public accounting when, you know, you were a senior auditor and your manager would ask what's still open, and that would take 25 minutes of me opening up 3 different Excels and sorting them, and then maybe going and yelling at one of my staff and asking why something wasn't done, then to craft an email back to my superior, whereas now you have that instant visibility. Again, this all kind of leads to reduced time spent on non-value add tasks. You're not spending time chasing PBCs, updating documentation. You actually are spending time assessing risk. And one of the things too that you get from a tool, especially like Workiva, it's fully collaborative. So you have your internal audit team, your C-level team, your accounting and finance folks, your external auditors, all being driven to one platform. And again, in the days of COVID, that's been a huge value add to a lot of our customers. And another thing with now everyone working remotely and we have increased data security. You know, Microsoft and all of that doesn't have the fences around it that we do. And I think that that's been something that's come up on every single customer call I've had in the last 6 months, is they want to talk about data security, because now they have people working on different Wi-Fi networks and all over the world potentially. So I think that kind of is us in a nutshell, the gained efficiencies you can get from switching from kind of a Microsoft Office or disparate systems and kind of putting your whole SOX program into one system.
That's great, thank you. And I guess that leads the way to the next polling question. So what is the primary technology tool you utilize currently to support your SOX internal controls process? Like many, is it a desktop tool? Do you have a homegrown system, a data analytics tool, a SOX specific, or a GRC software solution? Again, a reminder, please answer 3 of the 4 to get your CPE credit. And we'll give another 10 seconds before we close the poll. Again, very consistent with the benchmark results. We got great usage of a desktop tool, SOX specific, and then lastly a GRC. The last 2 tools not really being that heavily utilized, but again, as I actually said, great opportunities going forward just to automate the process, the document collection, etc., and collaboration that can just make this process easier, especially as we continue to work remotely. So, moving on, Larkin.
You know, we're finding that the efficiencies for us as a consulting firm working with our public companies, right, are quantifiable. And so we're leveraging Wdesk even in instances where our clients aren't necessarily interested in it themselves, or they don't want to make the investment to use a tool. We will use it because even though we know there's a year 1 investment, we know the benefits over time really outweigh those upfront costs.
Absolutely.
And just the ability to scale, Todd. I mean, the fact that, you know, there might be apprehensions, as you said, on year 1, but it's something that grows with the organization. So just making that transition to a tool is definitely going to be that fruit that yields fruit, although it's not a question of a one-time value.
There's a question in the chat that I think is worth calling out because it may relate to decisions about using tools, right? And that's, where do we see SOX organizations resting in companies? Is it a standalone, or is it, you know, is it done by management? You know, I see a wide range, both from a consulting perspective and from when I was in-house in industry. You know, there's everything from fully outsourced or internal audit running all of SOX. I've seen the controllers org owning SOX where they're doing self-assessment testing, as long as you're not testing your own controls. And then I've seen a hybrid where controllers orgs own the PMO, they own the documentation because it's their controls, and then internal audit or a SOX team exists to do independent testing of those controls. don't have any data to kind of quantify how that breaks down, but I would say that most of what we see is that SOX is separate from the controller's org. I think the pendulum tends to swing back and forth, and it's probably one driven by the mindset of the CFO and the controller and how much ownership they want to have.
Absolutely. Some more results. I know we're coming up on the hour. We got 10 more minutes left and a few items to cover. On this slide, really what we're seeing here is that most organizations are testing over 200 controls. We haven't seen a significant drop in the number of controls. This data obviously is very much dependent on the size of the organization, the number of locations, etc. But one interesting thing down the bottom is just the focus on automation, whether companies that are currently using it or are very interested in doing so going forward. So maybe for the panel, starting with you, Cristiano, what are you seeing at your clients right now in terms of automation? How are they using it, or how are they planning to do so over the next year?
I see growing interest from the clients, but still a lot of fear. And we are trying to, as a team, we're trying to think about areas where we can fully automate the testing. So it's change management, password, access. If you think about the way we still testing change management right now is we send an email to request for a population of changes. We get it back when we get it back, if we don't have to escalate. We choose samples, we send back another email. The email is then replied with tickets coming from a ticketing system or Jira or the system we take a look, we see that there's a signature, that there's an approval, and it's done. We've seen at companies, and we're trying to push the companies to do everything automatically. It's just like the system is we have the possibility to have a tool testing those things automatically, and it spits out like a flag. It's either green or red. And what happens is that it's not only from a testing control perspective, it's from the client. They have this continuous monitoring implemented that they can run on a daily basis. And if something is wrong, we go back to the reactives versus the proactive approach. You don't have to wait for the auditors to find things. You can find yourself and make sure that you fix as part of your business. So these are some areas that we would like to. We started discussions with the client. We see some of like concerns regarding budget, how we manage the changes. What if the system will change? What if we have some changes in our tools? And it's cost and changes that we need to make sure that we. But we did a calculation internally, and we see that you have a lot of time saved from the consulting perspective and from the company's perspective. You're not going to receive emails. You're not going to receive follow-ups. And there's still, as you can see, interest, but not enough, since we have, as we say, like 20 years into the SOX program.
Well, it certainly does seem to be changing. We are getting a lot more interest, and I think people realize the way we do the audit work, the point in time, it's got to change. That leads us to the next polling question. So how are you planning to leverage automation in your program over the next 12 months? Automating the collection of evidence, the review testing of evidence, underlying administrative processes to be automated, or a combination of the above, or maybe you're not planning to leverage automation at all yet in 2021. So we'll give about 10 seconds here for you to get your responses in. Perfect. Combination of the above. Certainly we are seeing that, and that's the approach we're taking as a firm. Certainly automating the collection of evidence, automating the review, and certainly moving towards automating the testing of evidence, as Cristiano alluded to, beginning with change management. Just simple routine tasks that we think can be automated very effectively when it comes to testing. So definitely we're seeing lots of changes here over the next year. Automation, I think, ties into the next finding from the study. One of the main causes for control failures, and it's people. It's either controls not properly being performed or human error. And so definitely an interesting topic as we think about how can we leverage technology more effectively. So given that these are the largest causes of deficiencies, maybe starting with you, David, what are you seeing your clients do to mitigate this risk effectively?
Yeah, what we are seeing is it's somewhat a bit duplicative of what may have been shared earlier, but it's moving those controls from a reactive or detective perspective to more preventative, and by making them part of that preventative design, they have to be executed before that risk materializes. So we think about your disbursement controls, right? Before any money is going to leave the organization and any journal entry booked according to that, that control needs to be executed. So you embed those controls, as I said, preventative in a workflow perspective. That way, that transaction is never going to be materialized until that control is done. But second to that, and I think an element that's also helping our clients really enforce not only are the controls preventative, but they're being done, is documentation of that. So some control owners are rather wary of this, but it helps instill some discipline within that control group, that if you document what you're doing, what are the steps you did to sign off on this review, it gives you more honors, there's more skin in the game. So implementing that procedurally in the organization is definitely helping, and making these, as I said, more preventative as opposed to detective. Thereby, we can avoid them even happening from a transaction perspective.
Interesting. Yeah. Any other panelists, any comments?
Yeah, sometimes we still see like controls fail because it's not perform as per the control description, and to me it's like it's so lack of initial communication, a lack of communication with the process owners. They should be responsible for this activity. If they, and sometimes they could also, to Todd's point, they can also, like, we need to listen to them. They could push back because the control is performed by them. They own the control environment. Until we don't get to the point that the control owners, they perform, they own the control environment, we still are going to see this type of failures. One of the things that I strongly suggest and is control optimization. As I said before, sometimes we fail controls and we put them as a deficiency, and then we realize, oh, there are other compensating controls. During an optimization activity, think about what are the crown jewels, the ones that must be performed in a perfect way. For these ones, maybe think about some sort of checklist, some sort of like automation or something like that, that is going to decrease, to limit the risk of failure. These are the ones that you have to defend. For the rest, there are possibilities of controls that can be centralized, can be transferred to someone else, can be deleted, because to Todd's point, if it fails, you still have compensating controls. Nothing is going to raise it to a level of material weakness.
I think that another strategy I've seen, not so much automation, but automation of workflow, is really blending the process of PBCs and monitoring completion status. So instead of thinking about just sending out requests for testing, sending out requests based on the frequency of the control, so that you're gathering the evidence and you can do a spot check, not full testing, but review and make sure that it's completed, so that you can eliminate the ankle biter exceptions, right, where something wasn't signed off timely or it was overlooked and it just fell through the cracks. Enabling that sort of workflow where you're essentially sending reminders to control owners where they need to respond, upload the evidence, and mark it completed. You can review it. Then what you've done is collected a repository that can also be used by the internal audit team and the external audit team to actually just pull their own samples, so that you don't have to have all this administrative back and forth over email to make requests. And where I've seen that implemented, I've seen a dramatic reduction in terms of these just run-of-the-mill test exceptions that cause churn, right? Once you have the deficiency, you have to assess the potential impact, and you have to document that. You have to communicate it to the auditors, and all of that creates inefficiencies in the process year over year. When you look at the polling responses, what I think is interesting is that there's really no meaningful difference between the 2019 and the 2020 responses, right? It's essentially the same contributing factors year over year, which tells me that nothing is being done to address the root causes of those problems.
Absolutely. Obviously, we are definitely coming up in the hour. One of the last things from the benchmark study was just the internal audit, and the focus that they have on SOX is still very, very significant, and the number of audits that they're completing outside of their core SOX activities every year. being actually relatively low, between 1 and 10 audits for most of the companies. Todd, given your involvement with our internal audit clients, what are you seeing out there on effective ways that IA teams are just doing more with less given the current environment?
I think it's really a mindset around building partnership with stakeholders, not trying to be an internal audit team that operates under the gotcha model, right, where you measure your value on the number of findings you have, rather the transparency and open communication you have with your stakeholders. So where I've seen effective advisory work done from internal audit teams, it's really allowed them to do more with less, with fewer resources, right? As you focus on the must-haves, the compliance work for SOX, taking what I call an embedded approach, where you're not necessarily focused on the number of formal audit projects that you have on the plan, but making sure that the internal audit team is actively involved in critical projects or initiatives across the company, so that you're really doing what I'd call real-time risk monitoring, right? Whether it's having someone sitting in on steering committee meetings periodically, or getting communications on status, making sure that risks are being addressed in real time rather than from the perspective of a historical audit. I think that allows the chief auditor really to communicate with the audit committee with a higher level of assurance to say, we're on top of these things. You're not going to wait for my 2021 audit plan to tell you how something went in fiscal year 20. So I think that's sort of a model where the smaller your team, the more critical it is to embed that approach, so that you're not getting caught up on issuing formal reports, but you're doing work that can drive meaningful change in real time, while still, of course, maintaining independence and objectivity.
Right. So we have our last polling question. In 2021, who will perform the SOX testing in your organization? Will it be internal audit, a dedicated SOX team separate from internal audit, the business stakeholders, external consultants, or a combination of the above? It's the last of the 4 questions that we had today. Give another few seconds just to get your responses in. Make sure everybody gets their CPE, and do note a minute past the hour, so we can certainly wrap up, but appreciate your responses here. Seems like internal audit, again, assuming the responsibility for getting the vast majority of the SOX work done. Obviously, you guys are all very busy. So quickly, we will thank you all for your participation, your attendance today. We will send out the slides. We will also send out the benchmark report along with the summary that Armanino's put together. Thank you to all the panelists, Ashley, Cristiano, David, Todd. Thank you for your insights today. Very valuable, very much appreciated. On behalf of Armanino and Workiva, I want to thank all the attendees today. Much appreciated for you guys showing up. I know you're all very busy jumping from Zoom call to Zoom call, so I appreciate your time here today. Much appreciated. Have a great day and stay well.
Thanks, Jim. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.